Harriet Mitchell had grown accustomed to the soothing rhythms of her retirement days in Southwind Shores. Her cozy coastal cottage overlooked the wide expanse of the Atlantic, and each morning she took a brief walk along the shoreline to watch the sunrise shimmer upon the waves. Afterward, she returned home to prepare a pot of loose-leaf chamomile tea and settle into her wicker chair with a good novel, or the occasional crossword. It was a routine that promised no surprises, until the day a small, unremarkable package arrived at her doorstep. The package looked ordinary enough, wrapped in plain brown paper without a return address. Harriet's curiosity was piqued once she noticed a faint scrawl across the front that read, "Solve the puzzle, find the truth." She'd never seen that handwriting before, which made the mystery all the more enticing. Setting her mug of tea down on the worn wooden side table, she carefully opened the box to discover a handcrafted wooden puzzle box nestled snugly inside. A single white note was tucked beside the puzzle box, the message equally cryptic. "I entrust this to you, only you. When you solve it, follow where it leads." No name, no date, nothing but that intriguing instruction. Harriet studied the puzzle box. It was carved from faded mahogany and decorated with small, ornate inlays of silver. Each side contained irregular grooves and tiny levers, suggesting that it could be manipulated in several ways. Part of her, the logical ex-schoolteacher side, insisted that it might be some misguided prank. But as she turned the box in her hands, she realized it was far more intricate than anything a casual prankster might produce. Intrigued, Harriet carefully pressed a small silver lever on one side. It clicked, but didn't release a compartment. Instead, a corner on the opposite side rotated slightly. She spent the next hour delicately sliding panels, pressing on compartments and twisting knobs, determined to crack the elaborate code. Now and then she set it aside to leaf through her old puzzle references books she kept from her teaching days, hoping for a clue. However, she found no immediate solution in texts relating to logic puzzles or mechanical inventions from centuries past. Her mind teemed with questions. Who would send such a complex contraption to her? She'd always loved a challenge, but didn't have many puzzle-oriented friends, and the note's wording was undeniably personal, indicating she was singled out for a reason. After a fruitless afternoon of experimentation, Harriet decided it might help to show the puzzle box to her friend and neighbor, Charles Lyons. Charles was a recent transplant from the city, a retired weekly newspaper editor who valued his privacy, but occasionally strolled over for a chat. He had an eye for detail, and Harriet hoped he might notice something she'd overlooked. That evening, she placed the puzzle box in a canvas tote and strolled across the street to Charles's tidy bungalow. As she approached, she saw him tending to his modest front garden of hydrangeas. He straightened up at her footsteps, brushing soil from his palms. "Harriet," he said warmly, nodding a welcome, "what brings you out on such a breezy evening?" The sun was dipping toward the horizon, casting the last golden rays on the pastel-colored cottages. Harriet held up the puzzle box carefully. "I received something peculiar today. Thought maybe you could take a look." Charles escorted her inside, offering her a seat at his small dining table. His bungalow was full of neatly organized bookshelves, framed newspaper clippings from his career, and a comfortable reading lamp. Harriet set the puzzle box on the table, and Charles's brows lifted in barely contained curiosity. "Never seen one quite like this," he admitted. He ran his fingertips along the grooves, pushing softly at the corners. After a minute of silent study, he glanced at Harriet with mild admiration. "This is a real piece of craftsmanship. Someone went to a lot of trouble." "So, you think it's more than just a novelty?" Harriet asked. Charles nodded. "Absolutely. This might even be an antique. The silver inlays seem hand-fashioned, and the mechanisms are too precisely cut to be mass-produced." They spent the next hour trying small adjustments, comparing notes, and even sketching the various sides. Harriet began to feel a small triumphant flutter in her chest whenever they made progress, like the subtle shift of a hidden panel or a lever that locked into place. Piece by piece, a design emerged. A winding path of silver lines that expanded across the edges when they were in the correct positions. By the end of the evening, Harriet's eyes were tired, but her heart was excited. They were close to unlocking the box. In the days that followed, Harriet resumed her routine, but added puzzle-solving sessions throughout. She began taking the box onto her deck after breakfast, turning it in the sunlight like a treasure in a pirate story. Each panel that slid or twisted reminded her of old adventure tales she used to read to her students, stories of hidden passages and undiscovered chambers. And with every new click and latch, she felt a surge of anticipation. A week passed before she finally managed to slide open a slim compartment. Through the opening, she glimpsed a small brass key and a folded parchment. Harriet's hands trembled as she gently lifted the key out and unfolded the parchment. It was a map roughly sketched, with a line indicating the beach along the coast of Southwind Shores. A small X marked a spot not far from her own cottage. Along the edge of the map was a single word in faded ink: Sentry. That evening, she invited Charles over for tea. The two of them sat at her modest wooden table, the puzzle box and its contents spread out in front of them. The map had a curious shape, indicating a stretch of coastline near the base of a bluff. Charles peered at it, brow furrowed. "I've been reading up on the history of Southwind Shores," he said. "Someone once told me there were old bunkers along the coast, dating back to various times, military installments, maybe even smuggler hideouts. But I never found any official records about them." Harriet placed the brass key carefully on top of the map. "The puzzle suggests something was locked away. But why send this to me?" Charles nodded slowly. "Did you or your family ever have ties to the old days here? Someone who might have passed down knowledge?" She pursed her lips, thinking of her late husband, Albert. He'd grown up in Southwind Shores and often talked about local legends, sunken pirate ships, hidden tunnels, misguided treasure hunters. Perhaps, Harriet mused, it might be linked to one of those stories. Albert had never mentioned an actual bunker, but he possessed many old journals from his grandfather. Could there be a connection? Curiosity nibbled at her. The next morning, Harriet decided to do what the mysterious note had implied: follow where the puzzle led. She pulled on her walking shoes and, map in hand, ventured out to the beach while the sun hovered low over the water. The tide was midway out, leaving firm sand to walk on. She followed the coastline until she reached a craggy outcrop she recognized from the hand-drawn lines on the parchment. Just beyond the rocks, where the sand sloped upward, she noticed a curious patch of grass that didn't match the surrounding vegetation. The grass looked flattened, as if a hidden door might be concealed beneath. Harriet's heart pounded. This was no longer just a playful puzzle. There was something physically here. She knelt, pulled away the tangled seaweed, and discovered the outlines of a sturdy wooden hatch. Honestly, she expected it to be locked, but to her surprise it had no lock at all. Only a simple handle, rusted with salt. She tugged gently, hearing the aged wood protest, but it gave way enough to open a crack. She paused, glimpsing an angled corridor leading into the sandy ground below. A gust of dank, briny air wafted up. Anxiety swirled in her stomach, yet an unstoppable curiosity compelled her forward. Not wanting to go in blindly, Harriet scurried back to her cottage. She quickly called Charles, who arrived with a flashlight and a cautious mind. The two made their way back, and soon they were standing at the open hatch. With a reassuring nod, Charles flicked on the flashlight and led the way down. Harriet followed close behind, bracing herself against damp walls lined with shells and seaweed. The corridor opened into a surprisingly well-preserved chamber with a smooth concrete floor. The air tasted stale. The beam of the flashlight revealed shelves cluttered with old boxes, tin cans, and a battered wooden chest. Harriet's eyes widened as she realized they were standing in some sort of bunker, a leftover from an era when smugglers or clandestine watchers used the coastline. As she swept the light across the walls, she noticed a chipped plaque near the entrance, barely legible: Sentry Post 3. Charles exhaled in a low whistle. So, the word on the map was literal. This is the sentry. But who is the sentry, smugglers or soldiers? Harriet ventured deeper, her steps echoing. It might have been used by the military. Albert's grandfather once mentioned he saw soldiers patrolling these shores during his youth, but how it connects to this puzzle I still don't know. They gently lifted the lid of the battered wooden chest. Inside were old uniforms, stained by time, likely from decades past. Beneath them was a neatly folded document, corners yellowed with age. Harriet almost didn't dare to pick it up, but with Charles's encouragement she gingerly unfolded the paper. It revealed faded text, describing an initiative from many years ago, an order to maintain a covert observation point along the Southwind Shores in case of possible maritime threat. "This must have been decommissioned long ago," Charles murmured. "Somehow this space remained intact and forgotten." Harriet turned the page over. On the back, scribbled in a more personal hand, were instructions. "Keep it safe. Keep it hidden. The Watchers rely on you." Below that cryptic message was a hastily sketched diagram. She recognized the shape of the puzzle box, albeit roughly drawn, accompanied by an arrow pointing here, to this bunker. Puzzling further, she glanced around the small space. It was deserted, except for the chest, boxes of outdated canned goods, and a single metallic locker leaning against the far corner. The locker's door was sealed with a mount for a key. Harriet's heart skipped a beat when she remembered the brass key from the puzzle box. She slid it into the lock, turning it with a sharp click. Slowly, she pulled open the door. Inside were a few more documents, a leather-bound journal, and a second smaller chest, this one bearing a stenciled number, B17. A wave of excitement and caution swept over her in equal measure. She lifted the leather-bound journal first. Its cover was cracked, and many of the pages were in cramped, scrawling handwriting. As she flipped through, Harriet realized this was a collection of observations, asterisked dates, that documented sightings of ships, notes about suspicious activities, and references to local tide schedules. It reminded her of a watchman's log. The final entry ended abruptly, with no explanation. The watchers must have just vanished, or received orders to abandon the site. Next, Harriet carefully opened the smaller chest, faded photographs, old letters, and what looked like a thick packet of official papers. One letter had a heading from a government office in the 1940s, instructing local volunteers to remain vigilant. Harriet looked at Charles, and they both knew these items preserved a piece of history no one else in Southwind Shores seemed to remember. That evening, Harriet felt a buzz of excitement that she hadn't experienced in years. After they sealed the hatch behind them, Charles walked her back home. Before he left, he turned to Harriet, a thoughtful expression on his face. "This is important, Harriet. You've uncovered a piece of lost history. But we still don't know who sent you that puzzle box, or why it was so specifically designed to lead you there." Harriet agreed. She couldn't shake the sense that the puzzle box was a final piece of a very old puzzle. In fact, it might have been a way to ensure that someone would discover and preserve the hidden bunker's artifacts. But who entrusted it to her? Perhaps it was someone who knew her connection to Albert's family, or someone who remembered her penchant for puzzles and detail from her teaching days. With little more to go on, she decided to research local records, hoping for a clue. In the following week, Harriet immersed herself in the archives of Southwind Shores' small library. Old newspapers, microfilm reels, and sea-sprayed volumes of local history became her companions. Charles joined her, flipping through the musty newspapers from the 1950 Deserters' Watch. They found an article referencing a civil defense watch station along the coast, though it mentioned nothing about Sentry Post 3 specifically. Another article described local volunteers who offered their time during tense wartime years, scanning the horizon for enemy ships. Then, Harriet discovered a photograph clipped to a bulletin board in the library's back room. It showed an older gentleman in a volunteer uniform, with a gaggle of excited children around him. She recognized one child as her late husband's father, Robert Mitchell, and the uniformed man standing behind him was listed in the caption as Captain George Reynolds, a local watch coordinator. Harriet leaned closer, scanning their expressions, looking for hints. Could this man have had something to do with the puzzle box? She traced her finger over the photograph. Captain Reynolds wore an odd pin on his shirt, a small emblem shaped like a shield. Harriet had noticed a similar shape carved on the puzzle box's corners. That discovery brought a wave of realization. The same emblem was repeated around the bunker's interior, etched into the concrete near the doorway. Captain Reynolds must have been one of the keepers of Sentry Post 3. But how would the puzzle box have ended up in Harriet's hands all these years later? She dug further, sorting through local genealogical records. That's when she found a mention that Captain Reynolds had a daughter, Catherine Reynolds, who travelled extensively before returning to the area in her twilight years. Catherine, the record indicated, had once lived on the outskirts of Southwind Shores, not far from Harriet's own cottage. Harriet felt a tingle of excitement. Could Catherine be the one who sent the box? Maybe in an effort to pass the torch of knowledge. As Harriet left the library that day, she bumped into a figure she didn't recognize. The man was probably in his early 60s, wearing a faded jacket decorated with an old military patch. He offered a polite nod, stepping aside so she could pass. Something in his eyes suggested curiosity. Harriet couldn't help but wonder if he had also been researching something similar, but he gave no indication of wanting to speak and disappeared among the shelves that night. Harriet reread the notes she and Charles had compiled. She could all but piece together the story. Captain Reynolds and others had manned the watch station, documenting their observations in the journal. Over time, the station was shuttered and the bunker entrances were left hidden along the dunes. Perhaps Catherine inherited the responsibility for those logs. Now near the end of her life, she might have passed on the final clue, and Harriet, through her connection to the Mitchells, was the chosen successor. Yet Harriet had no children, no direct descendants to share this with. She felt a sudden pang of responsibility. If she didn't do something, all of this might be lost again. The puzzle box was meant to find a guardian willing to preserve the past. Harriet decided she would notify the local historical society, but first she wanted to arrange everything into a coherent account of the bunker's significance. If their community recognized the site, perhaps they'd preserve it, maybe even create a small exhibit to honor the volunteers and watchers who once stood guard. She and Charles returned to the bunker that weekend, armed with notebooks, a camera, and a deeper sense of purpose. They spent hours cataloguing every item, snapping pictures of the uniforms, the shelves, the chest, and the metallic locker. They made sure to keep the site neat and undisturbed, wanting to maintain authenticity. The project took on the feel of an archaeological dig, albeit a modest one, and Harriet found her heart brimming with a youthful sense of discovery. She found an old plaque that had fallen behind some crates. Its inscription read, "Here stands the silent guard, unyielding in faith." It must have been mounted near the entrance decades ago. Harriet carefully cleaned it off and set it on top of the chest. By late afternoon, a gentle sea breeze drifted into the chamber. Harriet glanced at Charles, who was studying the journal by lantern light. "If we let others know about this," Harriet said, "they'll ask us how we found it. And then they'll see the puzzle box. We should explain it. But I also want to respect the privacy of whoever sent it." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "I think you should let the Historical Society handle it discreetly. The box itself might just remain part of the story, not necessarily a public artifact. After all, it's your personal invitation." Harriet smiled. "Yes, my invitation into living history." They replaced the items carefully and returned home, both feeling a pleasant tiredness from a day well spent. Harriet couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so alive. With curiosity, she had feared her retiree years might be slow and dull, filled with more memories than new adventures. Yet here she was, stumbling onto a hidden piece of local lore. That evening, Harriet sat at her kitchen table and typed out a letter to the Southwind Shores Historical Society, explaining that she had stumbled upon a hidden bunker along the coast, containing relics of local volunteers. She described the items in broad detail, offering to share the location with them once they'd expressed interest in preserving it. She attached a few photographs as proof. Before sealing the envelope, she hesitated, considering how much to disclose about the puzzle box, but decided a brief mention was sufficient. It was enough to pique their interest without revealing the entire personal story. Days later, she received an enthusiastic reply. The Historical Society's curator, Anita Caldwell, thanked Harriet profusely for contacting them and requested a meeting at Harriet's home. When Anita arrived, a brisk, bright-eyed woman in her 50s, Harriet felt relieved that the baton would be passed to someone who valued the community's heritage. After Harriet explained the puzzle box's role in unearthing the bunker, Anita listened with wide-eyed fascination. "What a marvelous story," she breathed. "You've done exactly what any conscientious citizen would do. You saved a piece of our history." Anita promised the society would handle the items with respect, authenticity, and care, inviting Harriet to be a liaison in the project. Harriet was surprised by the honor, but accepted graciously. She felt she owed it to the memory of Captain Reynolds, to her late husband's lineage, and even to Catherine, assuming Catherine had been the one who orchestrated the puzzle's arrival. Over the following month, word spread gently through the community that an old bunker had been rediscovered. Locals offered to help with preservation, volunteering their time and skills to restore some of the water-damaged materials. Harriet and Charles frequently visited, lending a hand. Occasionally, Harriet wondered about the strange man she'd seen in the library, but he never reappeared. In time, Harriet decided that if he'd been part of the bigger puzzle, he'd find her again. When restoration efforts were complete, the bunker was carefully documented and sealed again, this time with an official marker from the Historical Society, so that future generations might reopen it and learn. Some of the artifacts, like the uniforms and journals, were loaned to a small museum exhibit set up at the local community center. Harriet, under gentle spotlights, explained to visitors how the watchers of Southwind Shores had once stood guard against threats that never came. She even showed them the puzzle box, though she kept its message hidden in her heart. As Harriet strolled home that evening from the exhibit's opening, the sun was dipping low, bathing the ocean in pink and orange hues. She thought back to where this all began, a humble package with no return address. A puzzle box that demanded to be solved. The secrets it unlocked were not just about an old hidden bunker, but about a piece of community identity that everyone seemed moved to rediscover. Pausing at the edge of the boardwalk, Harriet breathed in the salt air. She felt grateful for the sense of purpose the discovery had given her. When she reached her cottage door, she found another letter waiting in the mailbox. Her heart gave a little leap of anticipation. Could it be more clues from the same source? She tore it open. Inside was a folded note, typed on plain paper. "Thank you," it read. "You have honored our request. We knew Albert's family would ensure the story was not forgotten. Signed, C.R." "Harriet," murmured aloud. "Catherine Reynolds. Of course." Though their paths had never crossed in life, Harriet felt in that moment as though she had received a warm handshake across time. She tucked the note into her pocket and stepped inside, the hush of the cottage wrapping her in gentle contentment. She placed the puzzle box on the mantel, just beneath a framed photograph of Albert. It had served its purpose, and Harriet could only guess at the challenges it endured across the decades, faithfully safeguarding the map and key. In its own small way, it had ushered Harriet into an adventure that gave her retirement a fresh sense of wonder. Perhaps there were other secrets still lingering along the shores. Who could know for certain? But Harriet was ready for whatever came next, comforted by the knowledge that Southwind Shores held hidden facets still waiting to be revealed. She fixed herself a cup of tea and turned on the small lamp near her favorite chair. The cozy hush of twilight settled outside as she sipped slowly, reflecting on the new memories she had gathered. In this peaceful moment, Harriet felt a twinge of optimism. Maybe life had unexpected twists left for her yet. She had uncovered a sentinel secret, and in doing so, discovered a deeper connection to the coastal town she called home. The puzzle box might sit quietly on her mantle as a reminder, but the revelation it unlocked would forever live in her heart. And for Harriet Mitchell, that was the coziest sort of mystery one could ever hope to solve.